you everyone for joining us this evening. I'm David Kennedy, the chair of the Interior Architecture Committee. This evening, we're going to have a presentation focused on workplaces, but also could be more broadly interpreted. And it's really about making workplaces more inclusive for lots of different people. And it's kind of personal to me because I have a daughter who was in middle school when she was diagnosed as having Asperger's, which is on the autism spectrum. And she's now a young adult, but still kind of struggles with fitting in. So HOK has done more recently over the past few years a lot of research regarding how to modify workplaces so that they're more inclusive, and to present the work that they've done. We have Bill Boucher, who is the Director of Design for Interiors at the Los Angeles office, although he is presenting from—
David, can you speak into the microphone because they're having trouble hearing you?
Okay, all right.
Yeah, just a little closer to the computer, yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
And thank you. And Aaron Hayden, who's interior designer at the Los Angeles office. So I'm going to let them take it away.
Thank you, David.
All right.
As soon as you're ready, Aaron, we'll move forward. Well, good evening, everyone. Late afternoon. So thank you for having HOK participate in this series. And Aaron and I are grateful. We're thrilled to kind of be ambassadors, and we are two people of a rather large initiative team within HOK that works on the initiative around neurodiversity. And it's a 3-year-old initiative, but I've got 25 plus years of experience, mostly in commercial interiors, transportation environments, workplace, food and beverage, hospitality, and branded environments. And I've practiced in that area for almost 30 years. Los Angeles is my homeroom, but I work with teams and many of the other offices throughout the HOK network. Aaron, why don't you say hello to the audience?
Hi, everyone. Thank you again for letting us join you tonight at this virtual presentation. I've been with the LA practice, HOK Los Angeles, for about 5 years now. I came straight from school. I went to school at Kansas State University. So if there's any Midwesterners out there, hello. And I'm really excited to be here with you guys tonight. This is a topic that I think is so relevant and so important, and we're excited to share with you our research and findings. So with that, I will advance.
Great. All right. And so a few things, right? Before we dive into these 5 bullets, I just want to set the table a little bit while you're looking at this and reading the slide. You know, number one, today, this conversation, we'd like to say, is setting the table. We're introducing this topic. Part of the research around this is also making sure that we're making awareness as well. And so part of that is getting out there and talking about this. We're 3 years into it. This is probably a 1st or 2nd chapter type of content share that we're doing tonight. Nonetheless, it's kind of super important. But the interest for HOK is that this is one of the many influences on that wheel. And so if you think of a wheel as having spokes, this is one of them. And whether it's sustainability, neurodiversity, inclusivity, this one was generated about 3 years ago. The source of this interest in this area of research came from a conversation that Kay Sargent, who is a senior principal and is the ambassador, she's the thought leader for workplace strategy in HOK's global practice, had a conversation with a client. And the question came up about what was HOK's thought, ability, or point of view about the needs or the unmet needs of anyone that fell within the definition of the neurodiversity population. And was that something that HOK had on its radar screen? And it was not something that we had on our radar screen as a dedicated research topic. It was something we were aware of. As a result of that, the initial research paper was constructed by Kay. She reached out to a group of her partners, thought leaders and design directors and principals across the HOK network. First year produced a white paper and the initial research. That has led us to 2 subsequent white papers, the third of which is about to be published, and a series of presentations, awards, competitions, whether it's from anywhere from NCIDQ to Frame Magazine to the 2020 Cornet Award for Research Innovation. And so it's really important that we talk about this, because what we've done with it from the standpoint of interiors is that it began in the first year as a filter that we were bringing to our training of our interior design teams in all of our studios. In the second year, it was a call to action to bring more people from interiors and other practice sectors into the research initiative as it grew as a team. Thirdly, it was to bring more people as ambassadors in the third year so that we can be speaking to other practice areas than just commercial interiors at HOK. So where are we with this conversation today? Well, number one, you've already read it. Work isn't working anymore. And if you pair that with the current return to work or return to office, there's a real opportunity here, not only to be thinking about the unmet needs of making a workspace more varietal, to work harder for more people's choices, preferences, and needs, particularly coming out of the pandemic as we also put other filters like the potential of hybrid working schedules and models to businesses and real estate. That's going to become a very important conversation. We want everyone on this call to ask questions, be skeptics, let us know at the end of this what you've learned about this, but we want you to understand what the challenges and advantages in a very general way are for this community. But there are benefits to be thinking about that will inform richer, more deeply designed, more thoughtful spaces, whether they're workplace or not. And so we are a majority of minorities is a phrase that really captures the population that perhaps struggles to find the right niche for getting something done or achieving something in their daily life. We want to highlight our research and where it is to date, and it continues, right? But it's really about inclusivity, and this really rolls up into our inclusivity values and programs. But we want to inspire people more than anything else in this conversation and after this conversation, that you can really think about embracing, incorporating, working harder, that variety in itself makes an environment richer for the human experience, but a variety that works even harder might pivot to appealing to the unmet needs of somebody that falls, again, within the needs of the neurodiversity community. So these are really what we're doing, and we'll go to the next slide, Aaron. I'll share a little bit on our background, all right? Now look, you're seeing in this slide 12 thought leaders and professionals from the HOK Interiors Network. Kay Sargent's in the upper left-hand corner, whom we credit for kicking off this initiative, doing the basic research that got it approved to be rolled forward into a much larger team-based initiative. But that red box in the middle, that's Dr. Andrew Ibrahim. He is HOK's Chief Medical Officer. Not only does he guide our healthcare practice, but he also guides this particular research initiative and helped us understand the protocols, the appropriateness, the respecting the integrity that the research had to have, and that we had to be able to talk about this in a very sensitive, but in a very knowledgeable, as well as accurate way. He also is a practicing medical physician, and so he brings day in the life experiences to the table for us. And it was nice to be able to tap a thought leader in our healthcare practice and pull them into other types of initiatives that we're doing. But I'm going to turn it over to Aaron now to take over the next section. But this is a little bit of background. If you can imagine, this slide today probably has 40 people on it from across our entire practice groups, and it continues to grow.
All right, so our world has been impacted and our work will change going forward. This is time for opportunity. So as we know, the pandemic has had a great impact on how we now work. And we see this as an opportunity, especially as we return to the office, as a chance to start to rethink what that landscape of that office might look like. And what are some of the space types that currently exist, what's working, what's not working, and how can we plan better, plan smarter, and have spaces that are more inclusive. There's a compelling human and business case to be made for ensuring we approach the design of workplaces to help address mindfulness, health, safety, well-being, and inclusivity. This is really kind of our goal. We want to make sure as we're designers that the space is addressing the needs of each end user, and instead of thinking about just your workplace as a whole group. It's now we're starting to think about it as individual users and how those individual users might have different needs, and what are those needs to being mindful, to being healthy, to being safe. How can we help their well-being?
All right, some major headlines, right? So in our current research, 1 in 7 people in the world are considered neurodiverse. So it's a significant portion of our population. But the research also shows that half of people that may fall into this particular diagnosis don't even know about it. But that doesn't mean that they're not necessarily seeking out in their daily life, in their home, in the place that they work, in the spaces that they go to, certain types of settings with which to complete something, achieve something, do something, and interact. Now we're going to go through some slides I'm going to pull from in a kind of very high level, but for those of you on the call that are wondering a little bit more particularly if this is new information, what are we talking about, right? So ADHD is an example of one of the neurodiversity conditions. Tourette's, autism spectrum disorder, or otherwise known as ASD, but dyslexia and Parkinson's are also 2 other conditions that fall within this kind of definition. And so what's one commonality or universal experience for people, in this particular group is that they have heightened sensibilities, right? And sensitivities to physical awareness and their surroundings, right? And that not only can it be perhaps something that is an intervention for them, it might also provide strength in the workplace because there are connections about people that have these conditions and their possible talents. But heightened sensitivities is really the key takeaway. And if you just focus on that one headline, it says, how do we make a space work harder? How do we make it more varietal? How do we take something that might be standardized into some degree cookie cutter and bring more variety and range of choice and ability to it? And that's really where the conversation starts to get very interesting. A little bit later, I'll mention now, Erin's going to take you into an aerial view of one of our current projects, but it's a program area for a particular client that we're studying. We're putting the filter of the research of our neurodiversity work into that series of spaces to start to talk about how they could be designed, arranged, planned, and treated in differing ways that might have broader appeal to the needs of a broader set of population needs. Let's go next. All right, so here's some key statistics, and this is a presentation we'll be sharing. It's also being taped by the AIA, but some key things here, right? Depression is a very significant problem in this country. 14.8 million adults are considered not only be depressed, but also fall into the definition of one of the neurodiversity disorders. It's also been found, for instance, adults with ADHD are 8 times more likely to be disciplined at work for what are perceived as behavior problems, but 60% are more likely to possibly lose their jobs of the correlation to that, right? 65% of the 1.2 American adults that are on the spectrum of neurodiversity probably have higher above intelligence, IQ, right? Yet 85% of them potentially remain unemployed. Untreated adults with ADHD probably lost 2 to 3%, or what would be the equivalent of 22 days of productivity in any given year. And 85 to 90% of the neurodiverse population does, for a fact, know that they do not have it. So how do these all play into the way we think about designs for humans and human inclusivity as we move forward? Let's go, Erin. Thanks. Right? So what are some other findings that tell us something quite interesting about this population, right? People that fall within the definition of neurodiversity disorders exhibit extreme brilliance, right? It can be that they are hyper-focused on topics or tasks that they find stimulating, which means high productivity. But being able to see bigger picture while still able to solve a complex issue can be a particular gift. And there are clients that we have that have workplace hubs where people work on an assignment basis as opposed to a departmental assigned basis. And that has to do with having a gig pool of knowledge workers whose propensities can be applied to different facets of a business or an organization as opposed to a specific subset, right? And that plays into the strategy work that we do. But an ability to stretch boundaries and remain objective and suspended, being inquiring, right? Curious, challenging the status quo and thinking outside the box, innovation or innovators. And that possibly there's an ability to thrive under pressure that makes them very leaning or very susceptible to working on intense types of tasks and short-term orders. Let's go next. What does that lead up to? Well, I think you could call that superpowers. And this is the way that I think to put not just a positive spin, but a more accurate sensibility. Because if we know this about people that may have certain diagnosis within the neurodiversity disorders, we know that perhaps this is also something that we need to do to help point it out to them, help share that with them, and reinforce that not only what they have as a talent, but that there are places in the environment and in the built environment that they can go to achieve satisfaction and engagement.
We are freshwater fish in saltwater. Put us in freshwater and we'll function just fine. Put us in saltwater and we struggle to survive. This was a quote from an autistic student, and we think this really sums up a lot of the point of what we're trying to accomplish here, which is make environments that help people thrive. If people are uncomfortable, distracted, overly stimulated, understimulated, they're not going to be able to perform their best work. And we're starting to discover this through our research, that there's different nuances that we can adjust within the physical environment to help people have a more comfortable space and be more productive, be happier, be calmer, etc. So
Aaron, the only point, Aaron, that I want to add in here for our conversation for our group is that
Sure.
this really reinforces one size does not fit all, right? And so if you start with challenging that premise, we've spent the last decade at HOK designing flexible, agile, nimble, hybrid type workplaces for very advanced organizations, corporate organizations here in North America and around the world. This challenges it even further and says, not working hard enough. What does working harder mean? What does that look like? And how do we get there? We think this conversation is the lead into that next initiative.
thanks, Bill. Okay, so now we're going to take a little bit deeper look at what the neurodiverse spectrum is. So in the middle, where you have neurotypical, at one end, you'll have hypersensitive. And these are people who are hypersensitive to stimuli. So this could mean bright lights, crowds, unfamiliar scents, temperature fluctuations, bold colors, patterns, busy textures, anything that could be too much stimulation. On the other end is hyposensitive. And we'll try to keep you straight as we go through the presentation, because I know hyper can make you think of somebody who is hyper and not that they're hypersensitive. So we'll try to keep reminding everyone as we go. But hyposensitive is for people who prefer more stimulation in their environment. They could need more stimulation to just focus. They also could have some difficulty navigating their environment. So they might have difficulty seeing, so they'll need more contrast, or hearing, where they need additional sound attenuation. So these are the two groups that we're going to be kind of analyzing, the two ends of the spectrum. And I think it's also important to keep in mind that people will live anywhere along this spectrum as well. But we'll be looking at these two groups. So the design challenges. As designers, we know we need to be considering all 5 senses when we're designing space: auditory, visual, tactile, olfactory, and proprioceptive. But I think, to reiterate, we can't think anymore about these in a collective measure. I think we need to start thinking about them on an individual level. So someone who is working in a heads down concentrated zone might need some background noise or music to kind of tune everything out and focus, where another individual might need absolute silence or very little stimulation in that room to be able to perform their task. So we're going to start kind of breaking down what that might look like in different spatial environments. And what that leads to is a diversity of space types, both for hyposensitive people and hypersensitive people. So with the 5 senses in mind, what these space types might look like is something like this. As you can see on the hyposensitive kind of end of the spectrum, there's bolder colors, more visual texture, and bold shapes, patterns, colors. And then on the hypersensitive side, it becomes a lot calmer, a little bit more toned down. And as we think about how these might build off of each other, it starts to create this really unique kind of network of different spaces all throughout your building or your program that can really cater to each group. Bill, do you want to add on to this at all?
Yeah, I think that what we wanted to share here is that if you look at this visual on the right-hand side of the screen, this exploded axonometric that looks like a multi-story tower or building, you know, the future we think wants to look the maximum varietal way that it can because it needs to perform more highly. And if every one of those colors was indicative of a different type of setting and multiple settings, the strategies really talk about variety is the key to offering more ability, more comfort, and choice, right? Which goes directly to engagement and satisfaction. All the squares that you see across the rest of the page, the content here really talks about some conceptual studies that speak to, from both the hypo and the hyper spectrum, what types of spaces might work for individuals that fall at either end of the spectrum, and what types of spaces would help them feel more stimulated or less stimulated. And so these were studies that were done to talk about the dynamics between space, proportion, color, and contrast. They helped lead our thinking into what some of the strategies might be. So if you're thinking about what are strategies for diversity, the way HOK would answer that question is one, working harder means more variety, that spaces need to be less cookie cutter, less monotonous. Number two, there needs to be a broader range of setting types, shapes, scale, volume, and the amount of people, the capacities, and how they are interactive. Number three, there need to be differing levels of acoustical and visual isolation, right? That there are strategies around being able to do that, that human comfort needs some of those things to achieve something or be comfortable. In addition, the question becomes, how does proportion, color, scale, light levels, temperature levels, auditory sensibilities, whether it's music or white noise, play into that? And last but not least, to what degree can self-control, where you are able to actually adjust lighting levels, transparency levels, audio content isolation, to what degree can those help enhance the experience and give someone a greater sense of comfort or stimulation around a certain experience? So this is the beginning of the conversation for us. We took that and went forward with it. Let's keep going. So if you look at this particular slide, like to generally make the broad statement, right? So if someone is hypersensitive leaning, they're seeking a more calming, monochromatic, soothing, less distracting environment. This image on the left represents one of a number of staircase designs we did in a particular project, but the thinking here was to make it softer. The shapes are curved in nature, so it picks up on some biophilic influences, but this is a soothing, calming environment, soft light. On the right-hand side, you're seeing a pattern, which is a DNA strand for a particular client that was applied to a glass wall. And so the thinking here was to provide visual privacy, but to relate the nature of that pattern in some way to the kind of work that's being done in that space, because it's very much about strand analysis and strand DNA regulation. And so this was a way to tie those things together, but these are simple types of ideas, treatments, shapes that kind of help demonstrate what this type of person might be seeking out. If we go to the next one. So hyposensitive, if you are leaning in this way and you're looking for sensory stimulation. On the left-hand side, that could be color material, contrast, graphics. It could be a space that leans more public, assembly oriented. You're looking at the image at the top, dynamic patterns, large open areas that are highly visible. The landscape is accessible to everyone, almost a large scale gathering space. The examples in the upper right and lower right speak to color, pattern, texture, and how they play into a visually stimulating sensory experience that enhances the choice of that particular setting. The very dynamic cafe in the bottom center with the yellow and blue chairs. Again, not only was this meant to represent the brand of this particular company, it also was the one space that they wanted to be very fluid, very dynamic, and very activated. And at the same time, it's also a place that you can also expect and come to know that the noise levels, it's not an auditory quiet place. In fact, it's the kind of background noise formed by the activity in that space. And then the second image from the light in this particular slide, this pink slide with the grid, just talks about the use of projection, videography, and how kinetic movement can also make a space attractive to someone who is hyposensitive leaning.
We can design a variety of options. I think that's key. If you have heard us this whole time thus far, Bill keeps mentioning variety. We totally agree. We know the workplace is going to need areas for people to concentrate, process, create, learn, refresh, and socialize. But I think it's important, again, that one size does not fit all. And there's going to need to be at least probably one typesetting for both hyper and hyposensitive people in these environments, so they can start to be productive and they cater to their needs. So what are the space types? So this is kind of a high-level overview of 6 space types that we've identified here. On the top, you see hypersensitive. Again, those are the calm leaning individuals. And then on the bottom, you see hyposensitive, so people who lean a little bit more active. And we'll go into detail, kind of the physical attributes of each of these spaces, but this is just to show the difference between maybe more enclosed or quieter spaces versus more open and dynamic spaces.
And Erin, if I can add
Oh,
in
sure,
here.
please.
No, here are the next slide. So in looking at this slide represents where we were able to marry a series of space standards that exist in a client's real estate vocabulary with the sensibilities of sensory inclusion. And we brought those together and created this slide and talked about across the top. So blue represents spaces that are enclosed, semi-enclosed, or their placement is in areas where you're going to find less circulation and traffic, and the level of expected auditory and visual distraction would be low. Everything represented by the pink at the bottom, whether it's a concentrate focus space on the far left, all the way to the convivial social gathering space on the right, you can expect this pink spaces to be visually dominant, predominant in circulation and flow paths, gathering type places for small, medium, and large groups, whether that's 2, 10, 25 plus, or 50. These are spaces where they are more physically and visually obvious and attract people for that reason.
Yeah, so how does that start to play out across a floor plan, for example? So inclusive spaces is really about designing space that has this variety, as we've been mentioning. And we know as designers that color, materiality, textures, those can all be a form of stimulation, but it's also kind of layout and arrangement that we need to be considering. So for example, if you're placing focus rooms near a common path of travel, that might be visually distracting just from having people walk by, even though the room itself might be kind of a calmer interior. So this starts to kind of arrange or show an arrangement of how spaces lay out on an example floor plan, and how you might have, quiet areas along the window wall with access to daylight and views, and then the more engaging areas adjacent to the open office space for collaboration, impromptu thinking, brainstorming. Bill, did you want to add anything to this?
Yeah, I think that the challenge, what we liked about this particular assignment, we had a space program. It represents the assembly, gathering, meeting and conferencing, and alternative team spaces for a client's program. We were given 5 space types, a requirement for gathering, and in possible ability to connect this area to another floor, which you see in the upper right-hand corner here, the ability to have a connector or an interconnection in the staircase. But the goal was to take those settings and standards, apply them differently from the planning approach that was typical for this particular building, and then design each one of the space types to have at least 2 to 3 different options that dealt with color, contrast, light levels, and acoustical ability, whether it was semi-open or semi-enclosed. The goal was to take open and enclosed and explore the spectrum of semi-open and semi-enclosed in between, but pivot the planning, the placement, and the setting types in concert together to come up with a harder working space that actually divided these up differently than how they had been laid out on other floors in the same building. So this was the attempt to make this real estate work harder. This was the preliminary study that we did and brought it back and talked about how we felt this addressed 50% of an increase in the needs for more varietal space, which could equate to greater choice. And if it was treated as a co-working space that was public within the entire build out, that meant multiple groups of people from various parts of the building could visit this as a potential co-working center that not only valued open collaboration, but enclosed collaboration and heads down spaces as well.
Okay, so now we'll dive a little deeper into what those space types look like, and then some of the physical attributes of them as well. So the first type is concentrate and focus, and this is for people doing individual kind of heads down work. So for the hyposensitive people, the space that they might be gravitating towards would be semi-open or semi-enclosed. There also should be plenty of area to move around. You can see kind of in the upper left image, there's a man writing on the wall. So having writable surfaces adjacent where people can be working, up brainstorming, back at their desk. Also having active furnishings is helpful. So you can see the sit to stand desk as an example, and then using kind of calmer colors throughout can help people. On the hypersensitive side, their concentrate and focus areas should be more enclosed. You can see the individual phone booths there at the bottom. They should also be using more neutral, calmer colors. You can see the use of grays throughout, and then introducing like a small pop of color. In the two upper images, that's done through the furniture with the chartreuse and blue chair. One could also consider using like a softer geometric pattern, and you can see that also done in the phone booth on the upper right image. So these are just kind of some examples of how this might play out, and we'll start to walk through the next space type similarly. So for commune and process, this would be for people doing everyday tasks. The hyposensitive individuals might see kind of a more open space. I even like to think of like a coffee shop where there's like a little bit of a buzz happening around you, kind of evident by the cafe image on the lower left. And there's, you know, visual interest through the graphics, or in the image right above that, there's like a wall mural, something that's eye-catching and is stimulating visually. Then the space could also be open and adjacent to collaboration areas. You can see that by the upper right image. And then they introduce pops of calm colors in these spaces as well. So pops of green, pops of blue. These are, again, the calming, cooler colors, but used in a more saturated way, it can be stimulating. For the hypersensitive individuals, these people would prefer areas that are a little bit more protected, or there should be an option to have some semi-protection. You can see in the workstation image, there's the vertical panels kind of on the side, as well as the visual privacy panels directly in front of the desk. That can help make people feel more safe and secure. Also having areas for them to tuck away. So in the upper left image, you can see kind of the green like enclave or phone booth area where someone could sit, like slip in, sit down, work, and then kind of pop back to their desk if they need to. Also with the lower left image, you can see there's this nice kind of tucked away area for someone to pop into. It's kind of like a library setting with views out to the outside. So having views to daylight is critical, as well as introducing any type of biophilic element, which you can see in the lower right image. There's kind of a green wall area. So those are some of the attributes that could be applied for the hypersensitive group.
And Erin, the only thing I wanted to add there was from a planning strategy standpoint, if we're looking at the visual. So we made the deliberate recommendation, the active all hands gathering space in the upper right, closest to the main circulation and corridor that's adjacent to it. And as you graduate closer to the perimeter of the building, you go from large to medium to small to individual group settings. We pivoted the real estate gradually in that way, also taking advantage of daylight penetration, at least from the first 30% of the planning settings, with transparency and an open area at the middle of the node on the left. So at least you had some sensibilities. Main circulation runs at the top and the bottom, so that main circulation paths always look from a vantage point at an outdoor opportunity. But again, pulling that assembly area that typically ends up all the way out on the glass, where people assemble and gather and make the most noise, we pulled that to the interior and pivoted the real estate so that the me real estate was near the perimeter, the we real estate was on the interior.
The next typology is create, and this is for people doing creative brainstorming work. And for the hyposensitive individuals, the spaces should be bold and inspiring and use saturated colors throughout. You can see by the upper left image, they have a cool fun pattern on the floor, the interesting kind of geometric pattern on the wall, and there's plenty of writable surfaces. So that helps people be engaged, be up and moving about, which is also something that we encourage is active furnishings for this type of space. You can see the use of the all steel rock in the upper right image. And then another thing to keep in mind is just added visual stimulation to create spaces that inspire. So in the lower left image, you can see kind of the cool, like mobile type art installation above the grand stair with that's LED color changing light as well in the ceiling, which can kind of change depending on the activity. And then they have a really interesting glass film running up the side of the wall to help create visual interest. For the hypersensitive people, again, the people who are more calm leaning, these spaces should be a little bit more enclosed. They could be semi-open or fully enclosed spaces. Also consider lowering the ceiling so they feel a little bit more private and secure. And then one should consider using like warmer energizing colors, which you can see in the lower right image. There's the kind of gold and oranges in the booth seating. And then as well as in the conference room setting, there's like the pop of orange in the chairs, but overall the palette is pretty neutral and then just uses like warmer, brighter pops. For congregate and meet, this is the next space type setting. And this is for people meeting and collaborating. So for the hyposensitive people or the more active individuals, these rooms should have plenty of space to move about, as well as plenty of writable, pinnable surfaces. So people can be up and engaged and active, writing, brainstorming. The spaces should also use bold pops of color. As you can see by the lower right image, there's the bold yellow with the cool, fun blue light fixture over the table to kind of anchor the space. And one could consider also using geometric patterns or organic forms, which both are represented in these images in the ceilings. On the lower left image, I'm going to get my rights and lefts mixed up here, sorry. The lower left image, there's the cool geometric pattern with the blue background on the ceiling. And then on the upper right image, there's the cool like organic form that's running all the way through the space. So both these provide visual interest that can kind of keep people engaged and inspired. The hypersensitive folks, for their collaboration spaces, these should be semi-enclosed or fully enclosed. Consider having adjustable lighting or dimmable lighting so they can control the light levels depending on their needs. Also consider using warmer materials, more natural materials, as well as soft geometric forms, which I think is a great example is the lower right image where there's kind of the crosshatch on the glass partition. It's very subtle. It's a little bit of stimulation, but it's not overwhelming and done in a very light, delicate way. The next space type setting is Contemplate and Refresh. And this is for people who just need to kind of take a break from their work activities, get refreshed, restored, and kind of reset their minds, if you will. So for the hyposensitive group, these spaces could be in group settings, such as a cafe area, or you can see by the lower left image, there's the cool outdoor zone. Someplace they can get away, take a break. Also consider using like hospitality elements in comfortable lounge furniture for people to relax in. And the spaces could be somewhat semi-secluded or private, which you can see by the lower right image, how it's an open space kind of amongst the main thoroughfare in an open area, but then the furniture setting allows for like a little bit of privacy and restoration kind of within that bubble. So that can help people feel refreshed, but it still be kind of a part of the action, if you will. Then for hypersensitive individuals, for Contemplate and Refresh, these people will be seeking more individual settings. They'll be a little bit smaller, think more like snug environments where the walls are a little closer, the ceiling is dropped, it's more personal, it's private, they can totally kind of go into their own zone and not be distracted. So something that's off the main path of travel, that's a little bit tucked away, Also consider using softer, calmer colors, the blues, the greens, the grays, the more neutrals. Having access to daylight and views can also help people feel refreshed and restored. Okay, for the social spaces, the hyposensitive individuals, think large gathering zones for these areas. This will be like a grand stair, as you see in the upper right. Something that I like about this image, it's a little hard to see, is across the way and all the way around this area is like countertop seating. So this allows people to have like impromptu collaborations. They can sit there and work. They can be a part of the buzz and the action. And it connects you to that grand stair, but also can be a work point if needed. Something else to keep in mind for these areas is flexible furniture. So different teams can come in and move things around, depending if it's a presentation setting or a collaboration setting. You can see in the upper left image, there's a variety of setting types in that one space, and including some kind of active furnishings where people can kind of like pull up, rock around, or sit and meet and mingle. Also consider introducing elements of biophilia. You can see in the lower left image, there's the planter setting next to the lounge. So that helps people feel a little bit restored and have like a unique area to connect socially. And then lastly, again, keep in mind different types of visual interest. I think the lower right image is great because there's kind of layering of visual interest. There's an interesting wall covering on the back. Then there's a kind of glass partition with a striated pattern. And then up at the front is kind of a more saturated millwork component. So when you look across this space, you're seeing all these different textures and colors kind of combining to create a more stimulating environment. For the hypersensitive people, again, the people seeking a more calm space, this area should be somewhat secluded, but yet still a part of the main space. And I think the little plan, the axon plan, is a great example. So you can see the large gathering space in the pink highlighted, and then the blue is kind of using architecture to create a more protected zone. So there's a little bit of a like a smaller seating arrangement next to the stair there, which is a great layout or example of how to go about this, especially if they're in the same space. Consider having like larger aisleways around these areas too, so people feel a little bit more protected. They can have a better vantage point. Also, the spaces should be a little bit calmer, more neutral tones with pops of color, and the ability to be a little bit more like private if they wanted. So in the upper right image, you can see the little kind of enclaves next to the break room area where people could slip into the booth area and then get a little bit of privacy if they needed. And then they could come back out and join the rest of the group. Okay, gathering spaces. So for gathering spaces, it's important to keep in mind the variety of features and elements that we've kind of been discussing, having dropped ceilings for more intimate areas, a variety of setting types or seating arrangements, use calming colors, having writable surfaces or pinnable surfaces. And these should be dispersed throughout the plan and have kind of varying degrees of color or like enclosure. So that way people who are more hyper leaning or hypo leaning can kind of choose their own setting, if you will. That way they'll be the most comfortable in that environment.
And then I think when we talk about another example here, right? So one of our workplace projects on the left, you know, obviously, if you're thinking about arrival, reception, and waiting, which is the type of space that you're seeing here on the left, we knew that it was going to be hypo-leaning because of the very nature that people were coming through it. So in building upon that for this particular client, we added high contrast, indirect lighting, opened up the ceiling. It was acceptable for the surfaces to be harder from a surface performance standpoint. But the right-hand wall, in addition to being a project that achieved a sustainable level of certification, we also wanted to bring in an element of nature in the biophilic, but treat it in a very high contrast type of space. In the very same project, in the right-hand image, we had areas at the far corners of the floor plates that were off the main circulation path, quieter, still wanted to programmatically be lounge-like, but they were treated in a much more monochromatic, quieter way. The scale of these spaces was smaller. The comfort level, you could argue, was higher. They were placed in areas with direct daylight, and they had a higher degree of, say, accessorization, as well as, say, amenity and support. So both types of settings perform very well for different programmatic reasons and have different levels of appeal. Great example of variety from front door to back corner. And then in lobbies in transition, I think these kind of speak to themselves, right? We have a client on the left that wanted a very kinetic type experience. It's expressed here through an electronic element, which runs up as a portal on the right-hand side of this particular image, but a vibrant color that dominates the space as well, including all the upholsteries of the furniture. Whereas on the right-hand side, the thinking here was about slower, more methodical, calmer. While there is still contrast in the black and metal element on this particular interconnecting staircase, the thinking here was that this was a visually quieter, less stimulating, more appealing space. And they almost are indicative of the way a person pivots or adapts to it upon arrival. And while the right-hand space is used for group events and gatherings by that particular client, the thinking was to establish calmness in the form of a kind of neutral oasis when you walked in, versus the client on the left that wanted a very vibrant, kinetic, electronic experience upon arrival. So you can imagine the space on the left easily has music, space on the right, much quieter. Think of the zen of a running water fountain. As we look to engaging spaces, again, this is a recreation room for two different clients. On the left, highly kinetic, high contrast, a lot of pattern, a lot of color, bright high levels. This entire pattern story on the left-hand side is a riot of patterns that allow for all of the multiple colors of the 37 branded companies that share this space in one headquarters project. On the right-hand side, we've got one particular client. They're actually financial services. So they wanted a softer, more bespoke, club-inspired type gathering space that was also recreation in the form of billiards, but still have the ability to have media, softer furniture, softer colors. And while dark is used as an anchor of the space at the back, it's visually quieter, warmer, and richer. Aaron, you talk about this one because we love to show this. This is from one of our Convene projects in downtown Los Angeles, but it is the exact same space on two different floors of that build out.
Yeah, so for this space, I think it's a great example of showing kind of the same space, but done two different ways and on two different floors. So for the hyposensitive, you can see the use of more bold, saturated colors. There's more interesting furniture that kind of provides variety for different people to have different stimulation. And then on the hypersensitive side, it's a little bit more residential, it's softer, it's calmer. It's a very similar look for both, but I think it's done successfully to meet the needs of both hypo and hypersensitive people, and yet not feel kind of like the two spaces don't match or don't belong. So keeping some consistent elements like the ceiling detail, and then the lighting fixtures are just changing, or, you know, having the banquette seating run all the way around the window line, but then the fabric is changing. So I think, you know, we can start to be thoughtful about this so it doesn't feel like it's just a chaos of a plan where, you know, all these different things are happening and there's so many different colors and it's kind of like ebbing and flowing in a crazy manner. I think, you know, zoning can be helpful. Being very intentional about how we're placing these things or the colors and materiality that we're using can start to define some of these strategies and how we apply it. And then this slide, we just wanted to kind of highlight some of our white papers. Bill had mentioned earlier that we have all of these on our website, and then there's a new one coming out here shortly. But we can follow up with the links if you haven't received them already. But these are kind of highlighting a more in-depth version of what we showed you today, which was kind of the high-level presentation format of these white papers. And then to conclude with a quote, we believe that we are no longer designing environments, we are designing the inclusive experience. And I think that's really what we all want to do as designers. We want to create space that's meaningful, that's impactful, that's beautiful and functional. And now I think we're just kind of turning it up a notch, or cranking up the dial, if you will. That these spaces will be a little bit more intentional and specific, and serve a greater purpose. Like Bill said, work harder. And that's really, I think, the goal, and hopefully a takeaway that you got from this presentation. Bill, do you want to add anything to conclude?
No, I think the only thing that I just wanted to throw in at the end here is, aside from thanking this group of people for spending time with us this evening, is that, you know, the filter that we've referred to a couple of times as this thinking around applying the research of neurodiversity, it now ranks in the same way that we evaluate projects from a design review peer standpoint when we talk about sustainability, inclusivity, best practices, innovation. This now is on the same scale of assessment when we look at a project holistically, internally, before we take it into implementation. So it's become one of those pillars, which is where we started this conversation. So aside from that, we want to open this up to Q&A. I think we're passing it back to David, and we're looking forward to being challenged by perhaps some thoughts, comments, and questions from the audience.
David, you're muted.
Okay, there we go. I was a bit remiss at the beginning not mentioning our sponsor, ECC. So we wanted to thank them, because they made it possible to you know, put on this presentation today. I noticed that there was quite a few comments in the chat, and Karen Feinberg brought up kind of two good points. They were related to in the management of the businesses that have these types of spaces. And then also she brought up a point about application to public spaces. So are we able to get Karen to maybe ask her questions? Karen, can you unmute
Yeah,
yourself?
hi. Hi, everybody. Calling in from Boston, from Minneapolis originally. Why, I don't know why I need to say that, but, and I was in New York for the last 3.5 years. And I've been a gym rat at times, and I couldn't believe how the gym was designed mostly for hypo folks. And the other thing, and I share with Craig Hamilton the question that he asked, and I don't mean to speak for you, Craig, but I was thinking the same thing of, you know, it's not so simple as creating the space for either or, because usually you have a team. It's almost like the Myers-Briggs, right? You have, which has been debunked, I suppose, but you have these diverse populations that need to work together. So how do you incorporate those two elements together? And then I think about co-working spaces, and that's complicated, because you might have somebody who can afford a co-working space and not an individual space, let's say in an accelerator or an incubator for an innovation hub, and they're forced to work in a co-working space because they might not be able to afford a private space, but then it's only designed for people that like that kind of buzz and stimulation. So those are 3 different questions rolled into one, I suppose.
All right, those are good questions. Can we start with the last comment and maybe work backwards, right? So what I think is interesting about the co-working thought is that, you know, Erin showed you one setting from 27 settings. We're just completing the design of our second convene in downtown Los Angeles. And they have radically different influences from the neighborhoods that they're located in. But I will tell you this, that with the resurgence of WeWork compared to Convene. Let me just throw out a couple of other names compared to Serendipity, compared to Regis. Regis and Serendipity as operators of co-working spaces are going to provide a higher degree of individual and small group enclosed spaces with higher acoustical ability. I think anybody that knows anyone that worked, rented, or resided in a WeWork, that yes, what WeWork did better than anybody was provide content, activities, and reasons that brought people together of like mind, whether it's an ice cream social, a networking conversation, a guest speaker, cocktail hour, et cetera, right? But you have to pick the co-working brand and environment based upon level of content, level of individual private needs, and acoustical ability, right? So I'm a friend of mine who is a, advocacy attorney that rented in WeWork, only went to WeWork on the days of the week when he could book a phone room in a quieter part of one of the floor plans because the metal and glass partition system on that phone room wasn't the most highest acoustical performing, but he had to, by habit, learn where the quieter ones were located on the floor plate. So there's a series of challenges that come with the co-working thinking. But I will tell you that one of the things that Convene did to try to differentiate themselves, and we started both of those projects before the pandemic, was they have a broader variety of single, paired, 3 and 4 person spaces, open, semi-open, and enclosed, because they were trying to be a grade level higher than the offering at WeWork, right? But still provide the medium and large gathering spaces with indoor-outdoor experience that people would come and book. So Convene's model is a little bit different. I think this is one where you have to shop market, see if you can afford that level of ability that you're looking for, and do a little bit of comparison. I can't speak to what that market looks like now coming out of the pandemic. I would imagine they all are making great offers to win back clients to come in and utilize their spaces. So that's my thought on your first comment. Your first comment had to do with fitness centers and gyms. Your third comment was about co-working. The middle comment, could you repeat that?
Well, there were two parts in it, and one was echoing Craig Hamilton's question, which is about how do you create, in a way, multi-sensorial teams, because you're not going to necessarily be able to isolate these two different kinds of spaces, because most likely you're going to have sets of people that had that neurodiversity working together. The other thing, I guess, my question is around how do you get management and real estate and developers who are designing these buildings, and that one that had all of those patterns, they obviously weren't really thinking about a diversity of folks that they were serving. And how do you as an architect help clients think more broadly about those needs?
Oh yeah, this touches on a lot of things. Aaron and I are probably both going to need to jump in on this one. So here's what our experience has been. Number one, let me be upfront. A lot of the photography you saw comes from larger scale projects. And so for some of our clients that want to appeal to a broader spectrum, let me give you an example of how it was broken down. In one particular client, that's media and entertainment here in Los Angeles, that has a big red letter as associated with their brand, in a large build out for them, which might be 120,000 square feet. Programmatically, it was not unusual to have 30 conference rooms, 45 individual phone rooms, 22 two-person huddles for concentrated work, right? And the way they did it was they split it down the middle. So half of every program component that was shared was designed to be hyper leaning, and the other half were hypo leaning. And so we developed 3 palettes and 3 abilities of transparency and audio across each of those subsets. And so, we were going to have to be creating 3 palette options within our scope of work anyway. So the way it was achieved there was a equal distribution across the floors and dividing all the shared spaces to be 50% leaning one way or the other. And then we had to develop 3 individual palettes within each of those leanings. So that was 6 differing palettes being applied to the shared space program. And that was where the variety was. There was less variety in the overall open plan neighborhoods that worked around all those common spaces that were shared, right? So that was a strategy for getting at that. You mentioned something though about working with clients, and I think it touches upon what I would call, how do you go about broaching this topic with a client, and how do they bring the HR partner to the table? We don't typically just talk about our research in neurodiversity. We tend to have a working conversation with the client that says, what are the things that are important to you if we've won the assignment, landed the assignment, been awarded the assignment, right? Does it include addressing the needs of this population? Does it include other things like diversity, sustainability, best practices, right? There are other types of influences that we might be providing in our professional services. If they're interested in going into this one, it typically, a flag goes off in one of our client team's minds about who has to be at the table. And it's usually HR for that particular conversation, because you don't design a space to meet the needs of a neurodiverse population and then label the spaces as hyper or hypo-leaning, or that they lean into people with certain disorders. You have to kind of have an operational approach. HR has to agree that you're going to provide variety, but your HR manager may know in our clients which of their knowledge workers have certain needs. Some people admit that and some people don't. There's not a legal requirement to do that. But often they do tell an employer that, or an employer is able to find that out about an employee. So there's a fine line there that has to work with it. And we've never succeeded in applying any studies for neurodiversity without the HR partner. The axonometric that Aaron shared for a national insurance company had the HR initiative and the HR manager at the table to address sensitivities around what we were designing, what the approach was, and how far we could go with it in terms of bringing it to senior management with respect to a best practice. So this touches upon a rather complex issue that I believe takes quite a bit of discussion and clarity in order for it to be enacted or applied to any project. That's been our experience.
And I'll just add on to that. I think that is a huge challenge, because obviously you're going to have different people on different ends of the spectrum working together. So another approach that we've kind of seen is doing neighborhoods, and this works really well with free address kind of policies. But different neighborhoods, as you kind of move across the plan, have these different zones, and are zoned in, like, depending on what the spectrum need is, if you will. And sometimes, you know, it's usually a partnership with our clients where they're coming, and it is kind of tricky because you can't, like Bill said, you can't really pull your employees to figure out what the needs are. But oftentimes the conversations with the client, you can sort of get a sense of what percentage they might want to identify as hypersensitive, hyposensitive, and everything in between. And so then when you start to create these neighborhoods, then people can kind of choose, okay, I'm going to go work here because this is a more comfortable environment. And then when it comes to having meeting spaces, that one's a little trickier, just because it might be more catered towards a hyposensitive, and a hypersensitive is in the meeting. And that's something that, you know, is going to take a little bit of thought, but just having the variety, and I think also having, you know, different furniture settings. Maybe you have like some small poofs or something that people could sit and be active on, even if the space itself isn't, like, you know, as visually stimulating. At least having some furniture that somebody could move in, or having rideable surfaces, or some of those elements in the space, so people who are maybe hyposensitive or hypersensitive can feel comfortable, and then the hyposensitive can feel like active and engaged in. But yeah, it is a challenge to make it work across the entire spectrum and not have it look chaotic.
So how have you guys seen this idea kind of play out in more public spaces? Like, I think that in one of our earlier meetings, you mentioned an airport terminal, and, you know, have you seen clients that are interested in applying this in a more hospitality or public setting?
Well, I think that's the intersection of a couple of interesting trends or influences, right? We're working with major transportation authorities here in the Los Angeles area, in Southern California, New York City, it's well known that, you know, we're in the last of 3 phases of the master planning and implementation of LaGuardia Airport in New York City. And I spent part of my time on the interiors team. And while that client, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, was not looking specifically for us to apply a study, research, and initiative of neurodiversity to the thinking around the planning, what they did want to say was, if that rolls up into a best practice influence that we should be considering, aside from the concept of transportation journey and efficiency from people in large groups arriving at a certain point and making it to a second point before getting on a transportation element like an airplane. What they were interested in was how to make public space and the retail, food and beverage adjacent spaces that they controlled more harder working. And what that meant was dispersed waiting areas of different types. There were 3 different setting types that performed at gates in 3 different ways altogether about how people gather, assembly, and wait. But the interstitial space, as the port called it, all that connective space between waiting and retail, waiting and food and beverage, circulation and food and beverage, what could be done to exploit that space to provide phone rooms, secondary retail services, nooks and niches for alternative places to sit that were publicly safe, enduring, and maintainable, right? So they were interested in variety. I wouldn't say that they were interested in applying that. In the work that we do for developers here in Southern California, particularly for an S&T building coming out of the ground in Northern San Diego, they were interested in us applying our thinking to the amenities areas, which is the 1st and the 5th floor, and the outdoor areas, which is a terrace and gardens on the 1st floor. And what they were looking for were places where people could go in that environment that do heads down work. Because an S&T or life sciences building that attracts that kind of client, you know, it's research at work. And it's the kind of environment where there's a lot of experimentation and failure before something succeeds. So that any S&T client that you engage with will tell you that that's a cultural question, is how to keep people engaged and revived when things don't get funded, failed, and have to be tried again or repeatedly, which is very typical in that. So the building is helping provide a lot of places for people to reflect, work individually, and work harder. That was a filter that came out of the neurodiversity conversation. I wouldn't call that an official application of the neurodiversity research, but it is, again, another example of where we think it reached the client for them to turn around and pivot and ask us to make the environment harder working and to deeply study it, as opposed to just giving what a typical developer would provide in that type of building.
Can I ask an addendum question, I guess?
Sure.
So years back at Harvard, I took a course at the Graduate School of Design as a part of my studies, as part of my first set of studies, I should say. It was called People and Buildings, and how space and architecture can impact learning, innovation, information flow, and trust. So I wonder if you could speak to this and how you develop flow of space to nurture, cultivate trust between people. It's a hard one to articulate, I would think.
Erin, you want to take first stab at that, or you want me to?
Sure. Something I think that's really helpful with trust is also having space that's intuitive. So something that's organized, something that's there's like a sense of rhythm to the space. So as you're starting to move through it, you know, we want spaces that have a sense of wonder and curiosity, but I think having some type of organization to all of that is really helpful, especially for people who are hypersensitive. They, you know, appreciate things that are more rectilinear in form, that have a little bit more organization to it all. So I think as you start to kind of like make bigger moves or zones, or even then start to kind of micro break down your plan, having spaces that are like intuitive to move through, and then the variety starts to come within that, is a way to maybe build trust and help people like navigate these different areas and be able to move through it. That would be my first response.
Karen, is it Karen that asked that question?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, and Karen, when you, and Aaron, I think that's a good answer. When you use the word trust in this question, are you implicating that the human population occupying a space, that the space allows them to be their best, to be engaged, to perform at whatever level they choose to deliver and participate in. Is that what you mean by that?
Well, that's a good question back to me. I think there's a lot of answers back to what does that mean, trust?
Mhm. I
The
mean,
person that was teaching this course had been in the CIA, believe it or not. So she was talking about hubs and gatekeepers.
mhm.
And so it's an interesting set of questions for that particular industry. But I think it's a subjective question to some extent, because what does that mean? You know, what does that mean to elicit trust in a space? That
Well,
people can
yeah.
learn well, innovate well,
Mhm,
trust one another in relationship,
mhm.
so that you're not fearful within a space.
Sure. But I would tell you that I think space is 50% of the answer to that question as a tool. And I think the other 50% is the behavior of the people within that space and how they manipulate, exploit, and use that space to help work together, work individually, work spontaneously, work in an organized, planned kind of fashion. I mean, in the last decade, we've helped large organizations, particularly in workplace environments, pivot. We're talking about 300, 500,000, 1 million square feet of space that's devoted to different types of workplace. Companies that have gone from hierarchy to complete unassigned open plan, where there's been a huge change management component to their culture and their real estate, often by acquisition of business and other types of business influences. But in every one of those projects, and the postmortems showed predominant success, but failure in certain areas and things that needed to change, and which is always part of the learnings. And those are good learnings because you don't get everything right, but you want to get most of it right. That's really, I think, the aspiration. We do a lot of upfront work around visioning, around discovering, around establishing project principles and guiding principles. It becomes part of the social contract moving forward. Typically in large scale projects where consensus building is important and there's more than one decision-making body, we need to engage on that level to get buy-in from a lot of people. And they're expecting that to be doctrine-like. They want us to lead them to looking back at that work and those findings to see whether or not we're delivering against them. You know, are we really making the promise work? But also in a big project that might be 2-3 years before it occupies, they want to make sure that the litmus test of how their business is changing over time is still reflected in the things that they approved and signed off on 12 months ago, right? And so we often find ourselves changing up design to pivot to a business that's evolving more quickly than the build out they're about to occupy. And that raises a whole other separate question, but we like to get at a set of guiding principles that become the social contract for the basis of the job. And they really talk about what are the types of positions, functions, features, and workflows that are changing, need to change, or require analysis in order to be better, right? And we have a whole strategy team that joins us in that exploration. And in a large assignment, not unusual for that to be 6 months out of the process, right at the front in the beginning.
We had a few comments from Craig Hamilton, and I think we touched on a few with Karen's comments, but Craig, did you want to elaborate a little bit more about what you were thinking?
The two things, and Karen asked a question about sports facilities and our practice, and I'm involved in a lot of college recreation facilities where we have tried to be an understanding of inclusivity sort of across a spectrum of how do you deal with how you feel about your body, from the hardcore athlete to the person who never goes because they're uncomfortable, and providing a range of spaces. And I think at that level, we've been fairly successful because mostly you're dealing with individuals, not groups. Although we could be better about neurodiversity. I'm not saying we've got it all right. so there's a way to deal with it there that may be different than what Karen was talking about in the kind of commercial sports facility that is membership based and is, you know, it's catering to a part of the market or part of the population rather than what we're doing on a campus where you're trying to cater or include as many people as possible. The second question was about kind of group meetings, because I like what you've talked about work environments and creating different places where people in the sort of spectrum of neurodiversity can be comfortable in work. But it was the question, when we come together, which inevitably we have to do, we work in groups and teams, would it be better to have those rooms work for, and I hate to say this word, kind of the lowest common denominator? If they're calmer, they work for somebody who's at that end of the spectrum, and you can do other things to get the hyper person engaged, in contrast to an overstimulating environment that shuts down the sort of person who gets overstimulated. Recognizing that those places where we come together, there's always a problem of assignment, right?
That's right. That's right. You know, it comes up.
Yeah.
It's
just kind of I've liked what you've done. It just raised a sort of like second level or third level question.
No, it's a great, Aaron and I will both answer this. This is a great question, because this is the challenge. Every client comes to us. They're like, I love that you're going to apply this thinking. I want to see what those solutions are, and let's make sure that they're in alignment with the budget. But you're the professional. You're going to need to make the recommendation to us about how to allocate, how it plays out on our real estate, right? What do we do on the operations side when, if you take like your client that you showed us that case study of, so they did half and half. Well, what if the half of the room type that I'm looking for my 8-person team meeting isn't available?
Yeah.
And I have to take them into an environment that I think I can tolerate for the meeting, but it's not my ideal place to get this team motivated, right? I mean, these are our corporate real estate executives, facility managers, and operation managers on the client side are asking these questions. And that's completely separate from maintenance, cleanability, warranty. That's a whole other, we don't go in that, because that applies to everything, whether it's specific or not. So I think where we pivoted with a particular client in Culver City was to say, okay, the rooms have a series of elements that you universally decide are relatively neutral. 2 vertical surfaces, table, portion of the ceiling plane, right? We're going to keep it simple. However, if you want to change the mood of the room, we're going to make sure that every room has the LED-based lighting color system so that you can really use that if you want to set that mood. The only recommendation we're going to give you is which percentage of those rooms should be perimeter facing and which should be interior facing based upon differing needs. The perimeter facing rooms had less ideation space because they had 2 or 1 wall of glass. The interior rooms were much better suited to be multi-purpose, flexible, ideation, multiple walls of technology, ability to write. So we actually ground into that. And then we came up with a universal theme, a series of anchor finishes, and 4 elements that could be mutable or chameleon-like, right? There was also a cost to that. So what, at the end of the day, 5 spaces leaned chameleon-like, and the rest, while they had different finishes and different placement, the rest were handled in that way. So you come to, I hate to use the word compromise, but you have to come to an agreement about how far to take the strategy, and where the strategy is very mutable and where the strategy is less so and more fixed.
Thanks.
Yeah, I agree. You know, we're having these conversations with some of the other clients I'm working on with too, and a lot of our corporate accounts have, you know, standards where one huddle room looks just like this, and whenever they require a huddle room, we know exactly what it means, what the power and data requirements are, every little thing that goes into that huddle room. And so now, you know, it's kind of breaking down these components, and I would concur with Bill. It's like having, you know, this kind of menu of items where it's like, okay, are we having huddle rooms A, B, C, D? And then how are we zoning those across the plan to create that variety? And that's really an ongoing back and forth conversation to how many, how much, how far do you push it? How far do you pull it back? But it really is about giving these end users choice. And I think in some of the conversations I'm having, at least, it's really encouraging people to kind of work the way they want or choose their own adventure, if you will. And some of the accounts I'm working on where it was like very traditional, where everybody had an assigned desk and everybody, you know, went to these specific type of huddle rooms or these specific conference rooms. And now we're educating our clients that maybe there's a different way of working. And the pandemic has definitely helped that with people working from home. People trust their employees a little bit better. And we have the opportunity as designers to make these suggestions and have our clients think a little bit outside the box in terms of what maybe was a typical once before can now maybe be this, you know, variety of typicals that we start implementing throughout. And it's not just, like we say, one size fits all.
Yeah, I mean, I like the questions because what we've been found over the last 3 years is in some ways, these questions are just the tip of the iceberg, and we've opened up a little bit of a Pandora's box in certain situations because everyone loves the intent of the research. It's how far to go with the application that raises, you know, the largest number of concerns. And then there's a valid question about what is the shelf life of the types of approaches and treatments and thinking that puts forth. And for, you know, one particular client here, and it was really just an upgrade of foam rooms and team rooms, it came down to 3 things. It came down to transparency and translucency and opaqueness, how that room had visibility or not. It came down to allowing those rooms to have multiple lighting settings and mutability around lighting levels, and whether there was 3 types of audio element that could be introduced, whether it was white noise, music, and one other. And so they boiled it down to a very short list menu of elements that they could control, that they could implement, that worked within their budget and were not difficult from an infrastructure standpoint. So, but those are popular spaces for that particular client for the reason that people can adapt them to some degree, as opposed to the spaces that just don't adapt. But we should never overlook the simplicity of something like lighting. Teams love to be able to manipulate lighting in rooms. There's no doubt about it.
I think that we have time for just one more question. And I know that Brittany Moffat had a comment about how do you signal to occupants that it's okay to modify spaces. Brittany, did you want to ask your question? I don't know.
Yes. Oh, sorry. Figuring out the unmute button. Yeah, so I was just curious because I appreciate that all of this is kind of also reinforcing a much needed cultural shift, and curious around, you know, do you see that in your work, kind of giving that explicit permission to embody yourself, however it makes sense to be productive?
Well, I think I'll try to answer it. I think if I understand it. So we've seen the most success in people developing, acquiring habits and feeling the permission and authority to change space through change management programs. Is that, you know, typically for most of our clients, there's always change management in its simplest form, even when they're just moving from an old space to a new space, or they're moving groups around within one piece of real estate and maybe making modifications. But on the bigger wholesale projects, there's pretty much always been some type of change management program. And we help put together guides, visuals, floor plans, and outlines that develop what you're allowed to do and not do, when you need to call someone from operations, and what you do on your own. Obviously, the more proficient and robust the booking system is for these spaces that help people with making the arrangements they need, technology is a big factor. but learning to use the technology and knowing who controls the technology is the back end of it for the operations team member in my client's steering committee, right? So there is a change management component that has to happen. And sometimes you have to demonstrate through video, through visuals, by going in and creating mock-ups, how to help people understand what they can move and change and what they can't. So understanding what's fixed and what's flexible and how to be bespoke is a very important part of that change management permission.
Yeah, and I'll just add on to that. I kind of like to think about it how we design like for lead in well, how we kind of go in and say like for well, for example, it's like, okay, you're going to need this signage. We're going to provide these healthy food options in the cafe. We're going to do all these different things, task lights at your desk. People are allowed to control these certain things. So those conversations we have with our clients, you know, kind of around like the well checklist, if you will, that can start to apply to this. It's like, are you going to allow your employees to wear headphones so they can go into their own space, or are you not? To have these conversations about all the different options that might help them on this scale, if you will. And then I had one other thought, but it just escaped me. But maybe it'll come to me.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
Sure.
Okay. Well, I think that we're kind of wrapping up our program right now, and I wanted to thank you, Bill and Aaron, for sharing this evening. And this is pretty important stuff. I mean, it's not something that you just sort of see. You know, you have to have some empathy about you know, what different people's experiences are, and then start thinking about that in design within an environment. And I think it's great that you guys are opening up the whole idea of doing this. So I also wanted to once again thank our sponsor, ECC, for making the whole program possible this evening. So, well, thank you.
Thank you. It was great for Aaron and I to be guests. HOK is truly grateful. And if you want to be connected to other initiative team members and learn more about us, go to the website, download the papers, search what we've posted on LinkedIn, and you'll find an amazing amount of material, far more detailed than what we got into tonight, actually.
Yeah, thank you all again for the opportunity to present this. I think it's a conversation we should all be having and be working as designers collectively to address. So thanks again.